Mhm.
Okay, hi everybody. This is Nick Brabulis. I'm the editor of Educational Theory. This is another series of interviews with authors who have published papers in the journal. Today our guests are Michael Hand and Laura D'Olimpio, who both have papers in a symposium set that they're guest editing on education against extremism. Michael, Laura, thank you for joining us today.
Pleasure to be with you.
Thanks for having us.
So the starting point of some of the papers in the set is the so-called PREVENT program in the UK, which calls upon teachers and schools to implement a curriculum that opposes some of the tendencies towards radicalization in students. It also significantly asks teachers to monitor and report students who are showing dangerous signs of extremism. That's pretty obviously a problematic provision. But clearly the issues of extremism and radicalization among young people is not just a UK issue, it's a global issue. Can you say a little bit more about the general pattern of this problem and why there's so much educational attention to it now?
So I think it's perhaps it is most pronounced in the UK. I think maybe PREVENT is the country with the most explicitly educational angle to its PREVENT policy. But a whole raft of countries are developing PREVENT type policies, and there's a greater awareness about the dangers of people being radicalized or drawn into extremism and terrorism. So in the US, in Australia, in the Netherlands, in Denmark, in France, there are major public policy agendas concerned with this. I think the UK has taken it slightly further in terms of concrete guidance to schools, where, as you say, there are two main strands to the PREVENT policy, one of which is this, what I call this custodial responsibility for monitoring and referring to the police young people who there's a real concern are in danger of being radicalized. And on the other hand, this pedagogical strand, which is concerned with educational interventions by which we can build resilience to extremism and radicalization.
Yeah, let's talk about, Laura, please, go ahead.
What we hoped was that some of the thinking around this was not just aimed at protecting and preventing a couple of individuals from being radicalized, which of course is a very important issue and a concern, but we wanted to also consider how some of those pedagogical techniques might be beneficial for all students as well. And so I think that in the approach that we're taking with the special issue, we did want to start with the focus in the UK, but then draw in, as you say, global perspectives and see if there might be a positive or constructive role for teachers, because obviously there's also quite a bit of criticism of PREVENT. And so we wanted to see if there was something constructive we could say, and then also whether that approach might be something that is in good educational practice anyway and connects to things that are epistemic and morally beneficial for all students.
Yeah, that's excellent. And of course, we'll talk about the authors in a few minutes, but it's a very international group of contributors and an outstanding group of contributors that you've put together for this symposium as well. I want to pick out a word that Michael used, resilience. Another word that some of the authors have talked about is inoculation. The idea that there's sort of an immediate emphasis of educational interventions, but there's also this idea of sort of, well, to use that word again, inoculating students when they're young from future influences that might tend to radicalize them, even perhaps after they're finished with school or when they're adults. So there seems like there's a sort of a short-term and a long-term dimension of this intervention. Can you say more about that?
Yeah, so you began by saying that PREVENT is a policy that's quite easy to criticize, and I agree it is. There are lots of concerns that have legitimately been raised about the PREVENT policy, but the line we've tried to take in this set of papers is to try and engage constructively with the idea that there is a positive role for schools to play in this general concern with trying to protect and prevent young people from being drawn into these ways of thinking. And so, of course, there's no part of our suggestion is that schools are the only agency with a role to play here, or even the main agency, but just that they are one of the agencies, and that there are useful things that can be done. And so, yes, our thought is exactly that there are things that we can do, maybe certain kinds of intellectual virtues, certain kinds of attitudes and dispositions we can seek to cultivate in young people through their formal education, which will better enable them to stave off the sorts of the influences and pressures they might encounter to draw them into extremist groups or causes or ways of thinking.
Yeah, and one of the theorists that we were very inspired and influenced by was Kasim Kassam, who in recent years has published this wonderful book, Extremism, A Philosophical Analysis. And in it, he takes a deep dive and analyses what the concept of extremism entails. And he's avoiding just sort of a definition that has necessary and sufficient conditions, and instead is mapping out this family resemblances concept. And in looking at some of the features of extremism in this sense, we can start to see that some of them might well be open to educational remediation. And the idea that we can do this prior to young people becoming radicalized as a form of inoculation, as you say, it lends a lot of strength to the role for educators, rather than, the process of something like de-radicalization is completely different. And I think that that's much more difficult. But we were very inspired by Kassam's analysis of extremism.
Yeah, thank you for that. I want to pick up on something you mentioned earlier, Laura. It also seems to me, from what you're saying, that there's a pretty significant overlap between the kinds of things that we would want to do educationally to prevent or to develop a resistance or resilience to extremism, developing open-mindedness, developing tolerance, developing an openness to other points of view, self-questioning and self-skepticism about one's beliefs and where they're coming from, which really are relevant in this particular context, but are also perfectly valid educational goals for all students. It isn't as if this intervention is just about, this is what these particular subset of students or potentially radicalized students need to be exposed to a significant degree. These are intrinsic educational goods and educational values in themselves.
I think that's absolutely right. Yes, I hope somebody thinking about the aims of education in general in the abstract would come to conclusions and recommendations not very different from the ones that most of us are proposing through this set of papers. What I do think is helpful, though, is to take this particular set of challenges, this particular set of ways in which people's lives go radically wrong, and use that as a way of focusing in on certain attributes that we might positively try to cultivate in young people through schooling. Yeah, as you say, we think they'd be there anyway, but maybe by focusing on the danger of extremism and the ways in which extremist thinking is troublesome, it might just help us to focus a little more sharply on what these attributes look like.
And of course, with the different contributions, we don't all highlight the same issue, of course. I mean, maybe that's to be expected, but we are all interested in something that we think is really important as a possible contributor to this going wrong, this, ways of thinking that sort of leads us astray. And so, each of the papers, I think, takes one particular focus that they think this is something that we need to be mindful of. And as we said, hopefully they're generally beneficial, but we make the case where we connect that particular issue to how it might help to educate to prevent extremism and radicalization.
Yeah, outstanding. So let me ask you each I want to move this down to a sort of a practical level. I'm going to ask you each to identify one thing. Might not be the most important thing, but one thing that you want to highlight, which would be an example of what a curriculum like this would emphasize. You can go in whatever order you want, but I'll ask you to each identify one.
One of the things that I was really interested in is critical media literacy.
Okay.
So I think that given that there is so much information and images coming at us all the time online, that we really need to be well engaged and well prepared to look at those things and work through them both critically and with compassion for the fact that we're dealing with other human beings with, thoughts and feelings and hopes and dreams, and a way of being able to engage online that is, inclusive, democratic, tolerant, as well as critical. And so for me, one of the examples that I drill into in my contribution to the issue is looking at the role for social media, and not just on how it can have a radicalizing effect on some individuals, but on how it can affect all of us. So the fact that when we hear about, say, a case of violent extremism or a terrorist attack, that can prompt a lot of fear and outrage and anger and all of these strong emotions that we all actually need to process and deal with as a community. So that was one of the things that I was considering.
Michael?
And I'll take the example from my contribution to the set as well, which is the idea that we might cultivate in young people a readiness to compromise. So the driving thought there, which comes from Qasim Qassam's Extremism, a philosophical analysis, is that one of the defining traits of the extremist mindset is an aversion to compromise, or an unwillingness to compromise. And so what might we do to actually cultivate in young people a readiness to compromise? And I explore two strands to that, one of which is a sort of the intellectual side, kind of why is it that life in liberal democracies is dependent on a readiness of citizens to compromise with one another, to strike compromises. And then secondly, how might we actually cultivate that trait, that practice, by giving children opportunities in school to actually make compromises with one another. So that would mean sometimes teachers not intervening straight away to solve problems or impose solutions, but encouraging young people who are in conflict with one another to figure out between themselves compromise solutions to their problems. So those are the sorts of things that I look at in my article.
And a couple of the other papers also, instead of looking at like a particular curriculum approach, defend a whole school approach. And so they want a much more holistic approach to helping to prevent extremism and maybe other problems as well.
Yeah, thank you. Those are great examples, and I think they also helpfully illustrate the point that while these topics or approaches may have a specific urgency for certain groups of students who we all, I think, are really concerned about, these are also intrinsically valuable and worthwhile educational goals. Let me ask you one last question, which is, what do you think are some of the limitations of what schools can do in this area, in this regard? And what are some of the limitations of what an educational approach can be expected to produce? Because obviously, through social media and other things, there are extremely powerful influences that are working hard to promote radicalization among young people and to recruit young people into various kinds of movements. And many of those activities operate completely outside the scope of what schools can influence or change.
Yeah, so in relation to social media, I advocate for this ethical attitude that for example, that I call critical perspectivism, where you're engaging with multiple different perspectives, both critically and compassionately. But I say that actually isn't enough. We need there to be policies and governance and guidelines that look after individuals, especially with how far our technology is advancing. There's going to be things that we actually can't discern, even if we're very critical and we're engaging, checking our evidence, checking our facts. There are going to be things that we can't discern whether it's true or false. Just for example, with deepfakes or with AI and how advanced this technology is becoming. And so I do think that while it's really important that we educate those individual traits to have epistemic and moral virtues, for instance, we absolutely need to be looked after and protected and supported by governance policies, and they might be educational, they might be governmental. And I think that because the internet just cuts across the globe, we need to come together, in a united way to somehow find some international guidance that, again, protects people. And this also has the other side of things like data breaches. And so there's the notion of protecting the individual, as well as combining that with looking for security threats and weaknesses. So it is a balancing act, and we need support from beyond the schools.
Yeah, your question's a really important one, Nick. And the danger with our project is that we might give fuel to the idea that this is a problem that we can leave to teachers to sort out, and it definitely isn't. Right? Whatever the solution to the social ill of radicalization and extremism might be, schools are only one small part of the puzzle. And I think we all, the contributing authors, emphasize that in our contributions. David Stevens, for example, in his paper talks about the basic problem here being socioeconomic injustice. It's the fact that we have got poor and marginalized communities who are going to be alienated from the mainstream of society in various ways, but most obviously economically. That's a major driver of people being ready to sign up to various kinds of extremism. So those are problems that go far beyond what schools can fix. So there are things schools can do, but we're just one little piece of the puzzle.
Absolutely. And I've been really influenced. Some of my colleagues from Europe introduced me a few years ago to the term educationalization, which is a translation of a German concept, which basically means let's assign this social problem to schools to fix. And there's lots and lots of examples in every country of significant social problems: teenage pregnancy, dropout, drug abuse, hunger, poverty, that societies which aren't willing to make the harder decisions about how to actually solve the problem have tended to allocate them to schools, and educators, because of our personalities and sort of caring dispositions, are the first to say, oh yeah, we can help with that. We can help to make that better. The problem is that sometimes it's not fully within the control of schools to solve these issues. And you're exactly right that David's paper is a really good example of saying, wait a second, there are drivers of these trends that have very little to do with schools and very little with what schools can actually change.
So I 100% agree with that. The only flip side of it is that what we felt reading the literature to date on this topic is that most of the scholarly literature has been sort of pushing back against prevent policies and counter-radicalization policies pursued through schooling. And we just wanted to say, well, can we rescue something of this idea? Is there something here that is worth doing? So we don't want to, we take the point completely about educationalization, but at the same time, we do want to make positive recommendations.
Absolutely. Can you just summarize, before we wrap up, can you just summarize the names of the other contributors? There's a link here with the video that will take people to the full issue. And as I said, you really got together a really outstanding group of papers.
Yeah, so in addition to Laura and I, we both have papers in the collection. There's David Stevens at the University of Nottingham. His papers, Recasting Fundamental British Values, Education, Justice, and Preventing Violent Extremism. Sigal Ben-Porath, who writes on Learning to Avoid Extremism. Direct de Ruyter and Stein Siekelink, based in the Netherlands. Their paper's called Creating Caring and Just Democratic Schools to Prevent Extremism. Diane Gerlich, whose paper is called A Whole School Approach to Address Youth Radicalization. And finally, Farid Panjwani, based in Karachi, whose paper is called Dislocating Meaning Towards a Hermeneutical Response in Education to Religiously Inspired Extremism.
Yeah, thank you for that. And thank you both for putting this set together. I'm really excited about this issue coming out. The topic and the problem couldn't be more timely and important. You did a great job as editors in putting together an outstanding set of papers. And I do urge people to read all of them, including your two papers as well.
Fantastic. Well, it was a pleasure working with you as well, Nick.
It was. Thank you so much for this invitation.
Take care.